Good morning. On behalf of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Glasgow, please allow me to welcome all of you to this webinar on Scotland's water future. Professor Fabrice Renaud, head of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and professor in environmental risk and community resilience of the Dumfries campus at the University of Glasgow, will make introductory remarks. This will be followed by presentations and discussions by the panel members. John Rashner, Deputy Director for Water Policy, School, Scottish Environment Government, Jordan Reid, General Manager, Net Zero Scottish Water, Rachel Helliwell, Director of the Centre of Expertise for Waters, CREW, and the Hydronation International Centre at the James Hutton Institute, Bill Sloan, Professor of Environmental Engineering, James Watt School of Engineering, University of Glasgow. Thank you to all of you for participating in this webinar. Fabrice, may I invite you to make your remarks?
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And I have a few slides just to introduce the topic. I would like to welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world, to this webinar series. I just wanted to emphasize that water is pretty much at the center of everything that we do. And in particular in terms of sustainability. So on this slide, you can see that water is central to pretty much every single one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that each nation on the planet is trying to achieve. Unfortunately, also, water is the medium through which climate change expresses itself the most, since climate change affects the hydrological cycle predominantly. And you can see here on the left that, for example, water scarcity has been observed in many regions around the world with great certainty. And this is, of course, affecting sustainable development in general, populations, economies in particular. So water is also a major hazard. And if you look on the right-hand side, most of the natural hazards that are affecting populations and economies worldwide are characterized by water. So that's through floods, through storms, or through droughts, just to give a few examples. So water is really at the center of many of the processes that we're engaging with, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which addresses natural hazards. On the left-hand side of this figure, you can see the progress that has been made in terms of access to safely managed water or basic access to water. The trend lines from 2015 to 2020 show for both of these progress. So we went from 70 to 74% of the population having access to safely managed water resources, and from 88 to 91% of the populations having access to basic water resources. The problem is that the trend that we're observing over this 5-year period, if we project it to the end of the Sustainable Development Goals, and here we're talking about particularly Sustainable Development Goal 6 on water and sanitation, it means that we're not going to achieve the aim of having everybody having access to safely managed water or basic water supplies. In terms of, in particular, safely managed water supplies, we need to quadruple the effort that is currently being made in order to be able to achieve this target by 2030. Of course, there is a huge disparity globally in terms of access or managed drinking water services. And you can see this disparity on the world map shown here. And since we're going to be talking in this webinar about Scotland, just want to emphasize that for the UK and Scotland in particular, this access to safely managed drinking water services is greater than 99%. So it's already achieved in terms of SDG 6. Because there are many issues related to water, the water agenda in the international levels is very prominent. And just last week, there was a UN event that led to the Water Action Agenda. And the objective was basically to really address the water crisis that particular regions of the world are facing, and to make sure that in the end, SDG 6 on water and sanitation can be achieved by 2030. And it's important to recall that access to safe water is actually a human right. It is not something nice to have. It is a basic human right. And that's why there is so much emphasis on this globally. Through this conference, over 700 commitments were made by member states, but also non-state actors addressing various dimensions that you can see here, such as reducing the pressures on our hydrological systems, for example, better managing transboundary waters, developing alternative food systems, because obviously most of the water globally, about 70%, is used for irrigation, developing better information systems on water, and also developing water-related infrastructure that can ensure the safe delivery of water for the public and for the economy, including, I must admit, nature-based solutions in this context. Now, focusing a little bit more on Scotland, the water resources are, as I have said, achieved in terms of access. So there is no problem of access of freshwater resources in Scotland, but it doesn't mean that because we have this success already, that we shouldn't be safeguarding the natural resources. And that's something that is where a lot of emphasis is being put, particularly since Scotland is a hydronation, whereby basically the aim is to develop these water resources for the benefit of the entire Scottish economy, and also in terms of doing the management of the water in a sustainable and responsible manner. There is an issue in terms of surface water quality. This is improving through time. Unfortunately, I don't think I can show you the sequence of images on the right with the system I have here, which is unfortunate. But basically, the last image that you see on the bottom right shows the trends from 2007 to 2020 in terms of surface water quality, and whereby you see a reduction of the bad conditions, which are the red at the top of the bars, and an increase in terms of the good and very good water qualities of surface water bodies in Scotland with time. So about 2/3 of these water resources are now characterized as good to very good. Another point here is that the Scottish water services have some of the lowest carbon intensities in the world, and certainly in the UK. And the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are achieved through energy efficiency, through the use of low carbon energy products, through carbon capture, and in particular, in this last instance, in terms of peatland restoration. And this is quite important because in the UK in particular, drinking water that is delivered from peatland is a big proportion of the water that is available to the populations. And this is also true for Scotland. So if we manage to restore peatlands, we are achieving multiple targets. One, in terms of climate change mitigation, of course, in terms of general environmental improvement, but also in terms of improving the water quality in the country. Now, climate change is going to bring new challenges to the UK and to Scotland in particular. And unfortunately, again, I cannot show you the sequence of images, but what is important here is that the projections to 2050 or to 2080 for two different scenarios show that summer rainfall is going to be decreasing by about 10% on average, but to a maximum of 16% by 2080 on the worst scenario, whereas winter rainfall will increase with time. So there will be changes in the rainfall regimes both in summer and winter, which will bring specific problems for these two time periods, perhaps droughts in the summers, and perhaps excess rainfall that can lead to flooding or more flooding in the winter. The image that you see of the UK on the right-hand side shows the supply and demand ratios for water for various hydrographic basins. And by and large for the UK, but in particular for Scotland, it is envisaged that with a 2-degree Celsius warming, the supply is going to continue to exceed the demand, particularly if we continue with developments in the water sector that are currently taking place. So to conclude, really, water is a big issue globally. Either too little, too much, not good quality, or with limited access to populations. And this is something that has to be addressed in every single nation on the planet in one way or the other. The situation in Scotland is better in the sense that access to safe drinking is of course ensured, but that there are still issues with regard to water quality, particularly for surface water. So there are good lessons to be learned from Scotland, and there are also areas that the Scottish government and other actors are going to act on in order to prevent problems in the future. I'm sure you'll hear this from the panelists later on. So with this, I thank you for your attention, and back to you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Fabrice, for this excellent introduction that will be very helpful for all of us to start with the discussions. Thank you again. I would like to go now with our first panel member, John Rashner. He's Deputy Director for Water Policy, Government of Scotland. Please, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Fabrice, for your introduction remarks as well. I thought this morning I would like to just reflect a little bit on the UN 2023 Water Conference. First one in many, many years, and I think well worth just having a little bit of a think about that. So I'll follow on with a few comments about that, and then perhaps set out a little bit of the nearer European context, and then finally try and make a few comments about the focus of this morning's webinar, Scotland's Water Future, and talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Scotland, and one particular what the Scottish Government is doing as we prepare to build Scotland's water future. So let me start with a few thoughts on the UN Water Conference. I didn't go myself, but I have spoken to a great number of people who did attend it, and I've reviewed the outputs from the conference over the last few days. And I think we saw 8,000 people gathering, over 700 commitments made. But for me, the context was essentially that this was a gathering which made clear that we were making insufficient progress towards SDG 6. And whilst we had so many commitments, I think perhaps only a proportion of them, maybe around a quarter, could be considered as significant or game-changing in the language of the conference. So whilst the focus of the conference was very much on taking action, it still felt in reading the papers that there was an awful lot of people calling for action, but perhaps not as much public commitment to action as there might have been. Another thing that I saw from the papers at the UN conference was an awful lot of discussion about both price and value. So many people calling for water to be accorded more value, and indeed many people saying that water is underpriced. It was an interesting reflection. Last week I was in Lisbon in Portugal and then Porto, talking to colleagues from Water Europe and colleagues from Aquapublica Europaea, so both essentially utility and wider water industry trade groupings. And one of the participants there was talking about value and made the point that in a very philosophical sense, quoting Nietzsche, he was saying, well, the fact that you accord value to something doesn't necessarily mean anything. You also have to accept that someone else may take the opposite view and accord no value to that thing. So I was reflecting on that and went and picked out my Nietzsche and had a little bit of a read. And the quote that struck me most firmly was him saying that the value of a thing sometimes lies not in what one attains with it, but what one pays for it and what it costs us. So I'm not following the traditional nihilistic view of Nietzsche. I'm just picking out that expression that he put forward, because I think what it costs us and what we pay for it are crucial as we think about water future globally. but Scotland's water future in particular. So what do I mean by that? I think it is the balance now between what customers can afford to pay, but also what it will cost us if we don't invest in water infrastructure, if we don't invest in good governance going forward. So this is I think the critical dilemma at the moment. How much can we charge customers? How much can customers bear to pay? And that's a global thing, but it's certainly here in Scotland, we have to take that into consideration. We're in a cost of living crisis, but we're also in a nature crisis and a climate crisis. So we can't afford not to act, but we also can't afford to overstress households as well. So this is the balance, the dilemma that sits in Scotland, and I saw it flowing right through from that UN conference and into my discussions in Europe last week. And it's interesting when you think about the European legislation that's coming forward, the directives that are coming out of Europe, they're mostly around environmental protection. They are largely around saying our water bodies need to be protected, our soils need to be protected, we need to protect our bathing waters. These are the focuses of the directives that are coming out in the next period of time. So that's all about cost, what it costs us if we don't value water properly, if we don't use water properly. It costs us the environment. So that's the European focus. In Scotland, the same for us. As Fabrice said, our water bodies are in an improving situation. We're certainly not complacent there. We have another roughly 10% improvement in water quality to make, and we must keep doing that. So the cost for us in Scotland is also the environment if we don't act. But I think also the big costs that we face now are flood and drought as well, and we can't ignore those threats. Even if Scotland is not in the position where we will suffer the most acute drought, you certainly see it in the rest of the UK and across Europe and the world. There are spots across the world, areas, quite large areas, that will suffer really acute drought over time. And I think flood certainly is something that Scotland is vulnerable to. And we see more and more damage occurring through flood each year as those winter rains become more intense, as the summer rains also, even if they are less frequent, the intensity of them is very strong. So what are we doing in Scotland to prepare ourselves for that? I think we're really looking at the three aspects of water. We're looking at water quality, both in terms of drinking water quality to make sure that's maintained. We have to keep investing in that. But we're also looking at environmental water quality and making progress there. We're changing our view of wastewater, thinking of it not so much as sewage to be treated and returned safely to the environment, but more as a resource, extracting more and more of the minerals, metals, and other products of value within that stream. We need to start building wastewater treatment works that are resource recovery works as well. And I think separating out drainage for Scotland is going to be very, very important too. The focus there really being climate adaptation. We can't continue just to allow our roofs and roads to drain into our sewers. We know the consequence of that will be spillage of sewage. We know that it will be combined sewer overflows running too often. We need to remove some of that surface water from our combined sewers and deal with it more on the surface. So we need to invest in that. So I return to my theme and say, essentially, we need to think perhaps less, of value, and actually think a little bit about the consequence of what it will cost us if we do not invest, what it will cost us. I think is a useful way of framing up the discourse as we go forward. And then the price of water. What can we ask people to pay for that? How can we fund and finance the change that is necessary as we go forward? And with that, I'll conclude, and very much looking forward to hearing from the other participants this morning. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for all these insightful comments. You mentioned you made several statements that normally one doesn't hear about the value or the price of water, which is the investment in good governance. And everything tends to be on pricing, but pricing is important, but there is much more. One, what you said, investment in good governance. And second, what would it cost not to act? as OECD has been saying for a lot of time, the cost of inaction to the government, to the businesses, and to the users also, to the citizens. What will it cost? And we all put our hopes in the governments and that they have these plans for adaptation and they guide us precisely to what should be a safer future. So thank you very much. And I will come back to you later on with a question, please. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the building Scotland's water future. So we have so many changes you mentioned. One of them, the climate change, droughts and floods. But then we also have population changes and we have urbanization, we have technological development. When we come back to you, if you could please make some comments on how to consider these big trends, these mega trends on building the future of Scotland's water, please.
I'll be happy.
Thank you very much. And now we will go with our second panel member, Gordon Reid, General Manager, Net Zero Scottish Water. There are so many expectations on Gordon's discussions and on net zero. The world is going net zero. So we would like to hear from Gordon, what does it take to make a nation net zero? Gordon, again, thank you very much for joining us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia, and good morning, everyone. So Scottish Water is the public sector water and wastewater provider to over 5 million customers in Scotland. And in response to the climate emergency, we are committed to delivering net zero emissions across both our operational and investment activities. And this morning, I'd like to illustrate how we're doing this and cover the progress we're making, as well as some of the challenges we have to address. We've been monitoring our operational emissions for the last 16 years, and I'm pleased to say that last year we reached a halfway point in our journey. And this was largely achieved by focusing on leakage reduction, which is 50% less than it was, alongside work to be more energy efficient and to increase on-site renewable generation. We've also been assisted by the greening of the UK electricity grid. Now, the graphic you can see on screen shows the makeup of our operational emissions. They're still dominated by electricity use. However, over the next 10 years, this will reduce to a very small figure due to our ongoing work on energy efficiency, increasing the amount of renewables on our assets and land, as well as major asset changes that will see significant increase to the energy we get from biogas. Further work to reduce leakage and to address customer consumption levels will also contribute to the reduction. A secondary benefit of on-site renewables is that by consuming the power on site, we can isolate ourselves from grid electricity price inflation, which is a major challenge at this time. Our prime use of gas and fuel oil is in the thermal drying of bioresource, and this is going to cease as we transform our asset base. It's also used for building and standby power generation, building, heating and standby power generation. And we've started the journey to convert our heating systems in our offices, and we're exploring alternative technology choices for standby power. We also have a large fleet of vehicles which we're decarbonising. We're replacing some 800 vans with electric vehicles, and to assist this, building a charging infrastructure across our asset base. And our heavy transport, though, is a much more challenging sector to decarbonise, and I do expect that this will transform to a hydrogen fleet when that technology is available. Water, of course, is vital in the production of hydrogen, and therefore hydrogen presents a risk and an opportunity for any water company. It's a risk as water for hydrogen is a competing pressure for water resource in a climate change future, but at the same time, an opportunity as a future revenue stream. We are working closely with hydrogen developers in Scotland to explore options for water resource that doesn't put potable supplies at risk, and are progressing a number of schemes where recovered final effluent is to be treated and used as feed for electrolyzers. Now, there's a further benefit that I also hope to unlock, where we can co-locate hydrogen production at a wastewater treatment works. We can use the oxygen co-product to deliver further energy efficiency and indeed capacity benefits, as well as potentially reducing process emissions. Process emissions of nitrous oxide and methane are a challenge for the water sector globally. And whilst they're only some 25% of our emissions now, in 10 years' time, when we've decarbonised our other operational emissions, they'll represent 95% of our residual emissions. And this is why we're working to grow our understanding of these emissions and exploring technologies that may reduce them. On methane, we've already piloted technology that can extract entrained methane in digested sludge, which reduces emissions. The plus is that methane can then be used to generate more power. Nitrous oxide, though, is much more challenging. Last year, we installed our first monitors and were not surprised when we saw the readings were some 30% higher than calculated values. And this is very much in line with what other UK water companies are finding. We're going to be installing more of these monitors this year to grow our understanding of these difficult emissions. And at the same time, we're starting to pilot innovative new technologies that may reduce these emissions. In Glasgow, for example, we've just started a pilot with some advanced intelligence control systems that's looking to reduce these emissions. It's only been working for a few weeks, and I'm very keen to see how the results play out. We can move on to the next slide, please. The emissions from our 800 million a year investment programme are all scope 3, but we recognise that we must address them. And we've identified 3 key actions that we must adopt to reduce investment emissions. As a client, we must select the lowest carbon option to address a need, and then seek to construct with low carbon materials and techniques. Now, that's easy for me to say, but very difficult to achieve. It's difficult for technical reasons, but also for behavioural. When a design team has many years' experience in designing reinforced concrete, they need to be encouraged to consider alternative materials. And we're doing a lot of work with our supply chain partners to change behaviours. And this involves engagement across organisations, from boardroom to site teams. We have to work at all levels to drive the right behaviours. At board level, we need to change the conversation to get carbon discussed and to get them to start asking site teams, what are they doing to reduce carbon? 30 years ago, we started talking about health and safety, and we've made great progress in this area. If we can get leadership teams and project teams talking about carbon, we'll be able to make great progress on carbon. But as the recent UN report shows, we don't have 30 years to deliver. We need to be acting now. And at site levels, it's about how to use new materials, and just to illustrate how you've got to pinpoint an activity to make a difference. Small things like switching off excavator engines instead of letting them sit idle when they're not in use can make a difference. Now, over the last 2 years, we've been working with our supply chain partners to identify which materials are driving the emissions in our investment programme. As you can see from the graphic, steels, concrete, diesel and plastics dominate these emissions. And this year, investment emissions are likely to be the largest single contributor to our emissions footprint. And we can drill into this data to break it down into smaller components. And with this knowledge, you can start to explore what we can do now to substitute high emission materials with lower carbon options and plan the steps to net zero. For example, with concrete, we know that some 30% of the concrete we pour is non-structural. So we can plan to transition all our non-structural concrete to the currently available low carbon mixes. And this is where the technical challenge comes to the fore. Where can you deploy a new material and what are its limitations? And when you understand this, you can make progress. Now, over time, greening of the electricity grid and deployment of emergent technology such as carbon capture on cement kilns will see more and more materials be low carbon at point of production globally. Until that time, though, we need to focus on not using material or substituting it with a lower carbon alternative. And every quarter, I see the art of the possible in reducing investment emissions increasing. We're already seeing ways to reduce the amount of concrete we use, to use lower carbon versions. We're refurbishing assets rather than replacing them, and deploying sustainable fuels such as HVO. And when we started this journey, reducing investment emissions was very much an aspiration. However, I am now confident that we can deliver net zero investment emissions. It's a question of when rather than if. And whilst we're forecasting reducing our operational and investment emissions, we know that we're going to have some very difficult to reduce residual emissions that we're going to have to offset with carbon capture. And we're looking to do this by restoring peatland and woodland creation on our land holdings. And in addition, we're exploring technical means of carbon capture, such as from gas turbine exhaust fumes, and will keep this emerging area of technology under review. We're making some good progress on the journey to net zero, but recognise we've got more to do. And the encouraging thing is that we're seeing more and more ways of achieving net zero to help us get to our destination. With that, I'll pass back to Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Gordon. You spoke of an area which is of great interest for the whole world. It's not water, it's water and energy, water and carbon, and water and all the intersection with all the different sectors. And in this case, you explained that from aspirations, we are moving to achievements, and you have this, you and all the people who work on net zero have all these new challenges, new materials, new ways to do things, to find solutions. And I will come back to you. If you could please please give us some insights on technology. Technology seems to be making a difference. And of course, in order for technological development to happen, you need this research, this investment, this foresight on how to incorporate the technology into your governance, into your decision making. So when coming back, if you could please talk to us more about technology, because obviously, I mean, clearly we don't understand its enormous challenge and enormous potential.
Okay.
Thank you. And now we go with our third speaker, Rachel Helliwell. She's director of the Center of Expertise for Waters, called CREW, and the Hydronation International Center at the James Hutton Institute. And just last week, we were talking with Rachel. If she could please brought into the screen. Thank you. We were talking with Rachel in this excellent meeting she organized on the Scotland Water Week. And so many important aspects were discussed, not only of interest to Scotland, but of interest to the world. And one of them is all this research policy landscape. So we thank you very much for your participation today, and very much looking forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for your welcome. And it's a pleasure to share my perspectives on the future R&D agenda for Scotland, which are largely informed by the policy needs of the water sector, represented by Scottish Government's hydronation agenda, the water industry and regulators in Scotland. So I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about how the policy and the research landscape in Scotland evolves. And it's very much, there's a very strong connection between those two factors, the research and the policy. And the central ambition there really is about the timescales of delivery and the needs of the stakeholders. So you can see from this, this figure here that the policy needs to have immediate evidence research, but that's very much informed by that longer scale blue sky thinking research, which very much drives that kind of policy agenda. So there's a policy push and a policy pull to inform those stakeholders. Now, much of what I'm going to talk today is about how the hydronation family work together and inform each other of the research to help make decisions in the policy landscape. And much of what I'm going to say today has been informed through the Centre of Expertise for Waters and wider programmes. Now, CREW is where most of the horizon scanning for our future research takes place. And the centre develops and commissions research that directly informs current and future water policy and the regulatory processes in Scotland. And it's basically our job within CREW to ensure that the experts in water research understand the needs and wants of the organisations responsible for managing water. And within Scotland, we have about 350 academics working in the water sector across a number of disciplines, and we work very closely together with that team. In addition, we have our Hydronation Scholars Programme, and much of what I'm going to say is driven by the needs of the policy advisors and makers in this space who actually come together and pull that programme of research together. Now, it's an elite postgraduate programme that's designed to meet the contemporary needs of the water sector and delivers very much the next generation of leaders in that water sector. So it's a very important programme indeed. And then the final programme, which steers the future R&D agenda in Scotland, it's just was launched actually last week at World Water Day, and the Hydronation Energy Innovation Programme is tasked to innovate in areas that address the reduction of carbon emissions in the water supply and treatment sector. So you can see here from this slide here that much of what we do in Scotland is driven by, much of the research we do is driven by the policy priorities. And that reflects like contemporary and emerging issues, and they very much represent the hydronation agenda and other policy areas such as One Health agenda and the net zero and circular economy policies. So apologies, sorry here. So these policy areas broadly map on to 3 thematic areas, which include hydrological extremes, coasts and risks, and water quality and health, and land and water resource management. And these areas, of course, are set within the overarching consideration of water and society, as people and communities obviously at the heart of much of the research agenda. And these cross-cutting activities focus on managing the impact and adapting to drivers of change such as climate, land use, urbanization. But research is also important for promoting that circular economy, resource efficiency, and the post-COVID green recovery. And this is all moving towards the net zero and just transition for Scotland in terms of its workforce and communities. So it's a really complex policy landscape, and our future research absolutely needs to address those policy goals. So in terms of water quality and health and future research, there's been a significant amount of work looking into emerging contaminants in our waters. Now, there's been significant work going into establishing the baseline for pharmaceuticals in the water environment. But we know within Scotland that the technology is not there for treating waters to drinking water standards and removing pharmaceuticals. So we need to start thinking more about a kind of paradigm change to looking at how we can control pharmaceuticals in the environment at their source. We need to think about how going forward we focus more on blue-green prescribing, thinking about education and behavioural change to stop pharmaceuticals getting into the environment in the first place. And going forwards as well, in terms of water quality, we're very interested in using and developing some of the great work that was done at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where wastewater-based epidemiology was kick-started in terms of monitoring and surveillance of wastewater in Scotland to detect the COVID virus. And through partnership working together with SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and Scottish Water, we developed a really excellent method of detecting the prevalence of COVID in Scotland. Now, there are a huge potential within this area for developing those methods further to look at other applications of that monitoring, such as illicit drugs, alcohol, nicotine, serotonin. The opportunities are vast, and this is an area which I see going forwards to be a real key area of R&D. We also need to think a little bit more about the hydrological extremes, and that they have been already mentioned by previous speakers this morning. But we need to think a bit more innovatively about how we reconcile floods and droughts in Scotland, and think about more blue-green infrastructure solutions, place-based, nature-based solutions. The opportunities here are vast, and the importance of engaging communities within these discussions is absolutely paramount. So making that transition away from this kind of, within a just transition away from kind of dependencies on more formal hard engineering solutions. We need to really think about those nature-based solutions going forwards. And finally, in terms of land and water resource management, we're the main research direction in that area is towards thinking about resource recovery and reuse, and to achieve some of the ambitions for our circular economy and the move to a low carbon economy. There is a real pressing need to think about how we can recover resources from all wastewater streams. And this includes supporting the water industry, both through the supply and treatment processes, but also through managing the manufacturing, chemical, food and drink constructions, and other sectors there as well. So, excuse me. Okay, now I wanted to say a couple of words about the Hydronation Energy and Innovation Programme. And I'm really sorry, I'm flustering a little bit because the wrong slide set. So I've been uploaded, so apologies for this. But this is very much an exciting programme, which is all in support of future R&D activities towards meeting climate targets through decarbonisation and circular economy. And the innovation is specifically needed in areas that address the reduction of carbon emissions in the water supply and treatment sector. And this new programme that was launched at World Water Day is very much driven towards connecting the technology readiness level technologies within the in the early, well, actually, I think I'm just going to just close this. Sorry, I do apologize for this. So to finish up, there are a huge number of different environmental issues within Scotland, and partnership working is absolutely at the heart of research in these oh, sorry, I'm very sorry. I think I'm just going to stop, sorry.
Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. What came out very clearly is all the innovations that are needed for the future. Research and development needs, as you have said, for every company that works on water, for the entire water sector, which is very broad. And then my question will be, when I come back to you, is what is the type of human resources we need? Because technology is advancing, needs are advancing, but are we? What will be our new green jobs, and what will be that new knowledge and new understanding that that is needed? So thank you very much. And now we're going to go with our last presenter of today, Bill Sloan. He's professor of environmental engineering at the James Watt School of Engineering, University of Glasgow. And Bill, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be here today. Looking very much forward to hearing your remarks.
Okay. So Cecilia asked me to talk about research challenges for the next quarter of a century. But I'm first going to take you back to the 19th century. The clip on the left-hand side there is from the Glasgow Herald, and it's documenting the number of cholera cases in some of the main streets in Glasgow. This was the Glasgow Herald that's from. So Glasgow at the time was a pretty squalid place. There was a sort of existential crisis in public health that led to a huge amount of innovation and expenditure on our water infrastructure. So we piped water into our cities using innovative schemes. We developed large treatment works where we treated the water and distributed it to the households and businesses. And then we spent a huge amount of innovation on our sewer system to take wastewater out of the city, and then learned to treat it in large wastewater treatment plants and discharge clean water into the environment. This is a paradigm for the urban water cycle that hasn't really changed in 100 years. In fact, Scottish engineers have been instrumental in exporting that paradigm to the rest of the world. Well, I would argue that we're now in another existential crisis that may require similar amounts of innovation and investment over the next 25 to 50 years. We're already seeing the effects of climate change in Europe. This is a reservoir in Galicia, northern Spain, where the water levels dropped to expose a town that was there prior to the flooding of the reservoir. The important thing here is that the farmers downstream of this reservoir are in open warfare almost, in competing for the water resources. So drought is causing conflict even in Europe. We think of Scotland as being a very water-rich country, and it is to a certain extent, but we are not immune from water shortages. The incidence of Scottish Water having to deliver water by tanker has increased over the last 10 years. And to many of our island communities, water is delivered regularly in tankers. The frequency of droughts will increase in the future. Fabrice showed a statistic about 16% decrease in summer rainfall, but that's an average estimate. The variance around that is quite enormous. So we could be looking at much bigger droughts in our summer. And as John mentioned, there are parts of the world where climate-induced droughts are making the land unlivable. So here's an image from the Horn of Africa where people are moving from the inland to the coast in order to obtain access to drinking water. So when every drop of water becomes precious, you have to ask yourself, so for example, if our 19th century engineers had been presented with a climate crisis, would they have designed large single pass systems that we use at the moment that take water from the environment, push it through our cities as quickly as possible, clean it to a hugely high standard, and then discharge it into the sea or our estuaries? I doubt that we would have come up with this model. Our existing infrastructure is vulnerable. We've got 47,000 kilometres of drinking water pipes, leakage rate of about 33%. Now it has been improving significantly, but it's still a lot. 50,000 kilometres of sewers. We have a lot of that water infrastructure is old. From UKWEA's latest report, about 50% of the pipes are over 70 years old. And that's of the pipes that we know about. 60% of the pipes are undocumented, so there may well be much more old infrastructure that we have to deal with. And that old infrastructure was never designed for a changed climate. And we're seeing the consequences of this with discharges of raw sewage during high rainfall events in England in particular. There's a huge debate about this, but we're also not designed our water infrastructure for droughts. So I seem to have lost quite a lot of the text on these, but never mind. So the challenge is really the climate change is exposing fundamental flaws in the engineered water cycle, and it's going to get worse. Water will be an increasingly valuable resource, and we have to find ways of not wasting water. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge behaviourally, but it's also a challenge in terms of technologies. We need to find technologies for recycling water locally. So essentially, one of the things that we fundamentally have to do is to hold water in our urban and rural landscapes much more than we are doing at the moment. As a consequence of this, it would reduce the load on our ageing infrastructure. And we have to continue to maintain that infrastructure, but we need to reduce the load on that infrastructure, because I don't believe that we're going to get the investment to change that significantly. This requires us to get technologies for recycling water locally, and not just water, but resources. So for example, currently we discharge water at about 26 degrees from our houses. By the time it's got to a wastewater treatment works, it's down to about 14 degrees. Scottish Water are doing some innovative things in extracting the energy from that, but we've lost a huge amount of that energy en route through the system. So can we think of different ways of integrating, for example, heat and water at local scales, but not just heat and water? We have waste treatment done at the local, waste treatment done in our houses at local scales. Can we think of ways of integrating wastewater and waste systems to do things differently and sustainably at local scales? Cecilia asked me to say something about the impact on universities. I think one of the things that we fundamentally have to do is to get away from teaching the urban water cycle model as it stands as some sort of sacred cow. We need to continue to teach the fundamental science and engineering, but give freedom to innovate and think of new ways of working and making things sustainable very much at local scales. We need to think about projects and research projects that remove discipline boundaries. So we have political scientists, engineers, economists, and basic scientists all working on integrated challenge-led programs to do things more sustainably and more at local scales. But fundamentally, I believe that we're not taking the climate crisis seriously enough at the moment. Our water infrastructure will be significantly challenged over the next 25 to 50 years, and we have to start planning seriously for it now. Okay, thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. This was absolutely excellent. Once you also emphasize the importance of wastewater, water as an increasing valuable resource, wastewater as a resource, but also you explain that there is competition for water resources. And with climate change, this is only going to increase. So what do we need to address all these challenges? And I think, like you mentioned, the academia has a great role to play. When we come back to you, if you could please elaborate more on that. Is it education? Is it research? What do we need precisely to address all these changes and challenges that are happening concurrently to these integrated changes? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill. So now we will go back to each one of our panel members with some questions. I will start with Gordon. And Gordon, if you could please address one of the questions we got in Slido about the resource recovery from wastewater streams. It's a desirable and technologically feasible step. How do we create an economic and regulatory pool to drive and support?
Okay, Cecilia, I think this links nicely back to the point Bill was making about rethinking how we value and treat wastewater within that urban water cycle. One of the biggest challenges we have clearly is that a lot of what comes into sewage works is very dilute because of the impact of rain. But when you look at how we could concentrate that up to make it easier to recover these things, this is where we get a multiple benefit, because we can take the surface water out, we can manage flood risk, which is only going to get worse in a climate change future, and make it easy. We'll have less spills to the environment from combined sewer overflows. So we get these multiple benefits, as well as getting a more concentrated stream to recover things from. In terms of the economic and regulatory pool, I think there's also the net zero angle we can pull onto this. So if we look, you heard me talking earlier about nitrous oxide emissions being very difficult to address, but a lot of those result from the ammonia load that comes from managing processed wastewater sludge. So that in treating that, you do get a very concentrated stream of liquor that's got high ammonia levels on it. And we are currently deploying some ammonia recovery technology there, which, if successful, will take a very significant amount of ammonia off that works, which means we should have a lot less nitrous oxide emissions. So there's a big plus from a regulatory and emissions perspective there. There is also a demand for green ammonia in the marketplace. So the business case, certainly in these for the early pilot, is looking attractive. But whether it will work for us at full scale is a moot point. But I think that we need to start looking broadly at these things. Ammonia recovery is one. Bill mentioned heat from sewers. There's a huge amount of heat available that we can do make much better use of. Equally, can we reuse wastewater, for example, for farm irrigation in some parts of the country? And that's certainly done elsewhere. And in a climate change future, there might be more of a need for that sort of thing. So yes, I think there is there's an opportunity to drive more these technological improvements onto the asset base. And changing the regulations can make a difference. If you look at in Germany, for example, where the regulations were changed, which meant you had to recover phosphorus from wastewater sludge, so we didn't lose that valuable commodity. These things the changing regulations can make a difference. And Cecilia, I'll just finish very briefly by mentioning, going back to the question you posed at the end of my presentation about the governance links in R&D. So when our governance decision-making process have been changed, it always used to be around about, well, what's the lowest whole life cost to address a project? That is now the lowest whole life cost and carbon. So very much in line with choosing the lowest carbon option. And interestingly, generally, the lowest carbon option is also the lowest cost option. So you get a good win-win there. We link as well into research. Rachel mentioned the Hydronation Chair, which we work very strongly with, but we've also got an in-house team that works across technology readiness levels, both from the university scale to looking for technologies that are working in other sectors that we can just lift and shift and bring them into water. So very active in that space. And we need to have a huge focus on that, because in net zero, we're doing something that's never been done before. So research is vital to drive it going forward.
Very much. Thank you very much again. And what you have said enlightens all of us. Research is needed. You have so many challenges, and you have a very, very important role to play, and you need all the support in terms of research. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. And now, if I would like to come back to John, that I had asked you, John, if you could please elaborate on how to build the future of Scotland And if we could include this part of the question 1, which is the political focus and the popularity. So also the challenge of policies and politics, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to pick up that, and I'll reflect back on your mega trends question as well when I've answered the question in the chat. So how do we deal with the need that the water industry has a long-term investment need? I mean, for sure, it is a long-term industry, and that's absolutely right. How do we balance that with the political focus? The questioner says on popularity, but I think maybe it's just that more acute need to respond to issues of the day. So I suppose it's a number of things. Structurally, we have a water sector vision in Scotland, which sets out where we want to get to, an ideal position, if you like. But then we bring reality to that by having a 25-year strategic plan, which actually sets out the direction we're going to move in to achieve that vision or move towards that vision. We have independent regulation for water quality, for independent regulation for customer interests, for the financing of the industry, and for the environmental impact of the industry. And we have a whole panoply of legal obligations which we must meet. So there's a lot of governance and structure that actually holds government ministers to account. They have to ensure that there is adequate funding to meet all those regulatory demands and requirements, and have a view to that longer term. Now, they will always, and I think probably properly, judge the political mood of the day. It's important in whatever you do in politics to take the public with you, to make sure that what you're doing is legitimate as you move forward. But I think there is enough governance around the water industry in Scotland to ensure that we do get long-term investment, and our track record here is very good. I think you have to look at the trend in investments in Scotland over the years, and it's been very, very strong and very, very consistent levels of investment. So actually, politics has delivered for the water industry in Scotland, and we do see improving standards, whether it's water quality, whether it's huge reductions in environmental impact, whether it's the quality of the water environment over time. So we are still on a positive series of trends. We're also more efficient at doing it. We're getting better at embracing technology more rapidly, and we're certainly getting better at researching and understanding the change that we're facing in terms of climate. And perhaps that takes me into the mega trends point as well. What do I see as the big mega trends that really impact on Scotland? Well, climate we've mentioned and spoken of greatly. Urbanisation is also really important. The real increase in the amount of impermeable surface that we're seeing is something that policy needs to consider, and I think begin to tackle. That trend has probably gone far enough now and needs to be reversed. But I also see a broader trend that impacts on us, which is global insecurity and global instability generally. But that instability and insecurity reflects back in increase in demand for water for hydrogen production within Scotland, increased demand for food production. So we need to produce more food. We also need to perhaps irrigate more in the summer than we ever used to have to do. So there are more and different pressures on water. Within the country, we also see west to east migration. So migration is the global trend. We see people moving to the global north, but within Scotland, we see people moving from the rural west to the urban east and central belt. And again, that puts different pressures on our infrastructure, creates different investment needs. So a volatile world in terms of people movement, a volatile world in terms of climate, and an urbanization that's putting pressure on our drainage system. So big challenges for us to face, but I think that the key will be strong governance, clear vision, and consistent investment over time. Thank you.
Thank you again. You have brought very important things because you have linked the big vision to the drains. So why is it important we have this urbanization and the migration? Well, it ends on impermeable surfaces, on more stress on the water systems. So thank you for making it clear. What is it that we should be worried about? And I wanted to ask Rachel and also Bill, a question that has been put in the chat, that is, how do we get past, and this is a question, also a question I'm making, how do we get past the inbuilt infrastructure effect that stops us investing and adopting new water cycle management approaches? Is it really stopping us? Or is it a transition, but is it happening? Rachel, please.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting one, and yeah, something that I have given a little bit of thought to in terms of, there's great research out there, and in terms of soft and hard infrastructures and so on. And there's guidance as well that's been produced. But I think one of the main challenges is how we transfer that knowledge and the data to inform decisions, and whether the planners who are responsible for taking these decisions are actually equipped with all of that great kind of evidence and understanding that's out there. So we are in this kind of transition in how we are managing the water cycle and how we are using infrastructures. But I think it's time very much to have that confidence to embrace the innovation that's out there, and for for planners to think about how we can adopt different strategies and approaches and so on. So perhaps from the research perspective, there needs to be kind of more targeting of that knowledge to specific challenges, which I think isn't quite out there at the moment. It's not quite there, but we're getting there. So,
thank you. And Bill, you had already mentioned in your presentation the water cycle. Can we please bring it with the aspect of research and development to this question? Is it that we are not making progress, or is it we're not making enough progress?
Well, I'll kind of come back to the question you asked, Rachel, and so I think that's one of the biggest problems actually is how, we've got this legacy infrastructure, and how do we move on from that legacy infrastructure and do things in a different way? And it's a real big challenge, because in Scotland, most people are extremely happy with the way that the water and wastewater services are delivered, and Scottish Water is a very well-respected company. But we've got a global imperative for change, which is, the climate crisis and energy and net zero, but that's not felt by local people. So in order to get different types of infrastructure in place, then people have to see the benefit of that in some added benefit over and above water. And unless the water crisis hits us very quickly and people are really struggling to get water, in order to prepare for water shortages, we have to add benefit at a local scale, which means working with communities, but it also means tapping into some of the other infrastructure changes that are happening. So our energy systems are becoming much more distributed. We're going to move away from gas central heating in Scotland, where gas is delivered down through pipe networks, and we're going to be delivering heating through things like ground source and air source heat pumps and district heating schemes. So there are opportunities there to link water and more local infrastructure in a way that takes the pressure off the centralized heavy infrastructure networks, and at least gives us breathing time to think about how to do things differently. So I think there's a challenge there in working with communities and working with different sectors to do things in a more distributed way. In terms of education, I think, or in terms of research in universities, the water industry had a very sort of a reputation as being very slow innovators in the past, partly because of the public health risks and the legacy infrastructure. I think that's probably changing in the light of their ambitions in terms of net zero. But I still think that they kind of hang on to that cautious approach. Now, I think where academia can come in is to fail. We have the luxury of failing in academia and in research. So we can do slightly more ambitious projects with the idea that some, well, maybe even 80% of them will fail, but working with industry to see where where these could have a transformative impact on the way that we do things in the water industry is where academia should sit. So I think it's almost incumbent on academics and the water industry to be more ambitious on the academic side of things.
Yes, you're very right, to experiment, and we fail and then try again.
Yeah.
And thank you. And John, precisely what is being discussed nowadays, how do we make this change? It's not only the infrastructure from one type to another one, but this requires regulations, investments, human development, so human capacity. How do you see, or if you can explain to us, how is that these changes happens?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's more than just infrastructure, although that really will be important. We have to make the shift away from, well, we have to balance our grey infrastructure with more green blue. I think it's important to understand that we won't abandon our grey infrastructure. We've invested billions of pounds in it. It performs incredibly well, actually, given the stresses it's under. But we clearly need to balance that with far more green blue infrastructure. And I think we need to do it at a strategic level as well. We need to have strategic, sustainable urban drainage rather than the tactical which we deploy at the moment. And we do need to change the way our wastewater treatment works, operate so that they do recover more resources, not just energy, although that is the top of the pile when it comes to the value, in cash terms. It's really, really important. But there are other values in there that we need to extract, certainly phosphorus being one of them, given its relative vulnerability in the world and its finite nature. So we do need to make all those infrastructural things, but we also need to change the way people relate to water in Scotland. And I think some of those trends are already happening and we can promote them. I think we've seen a huge interest in the water environment, the natural water environment, which is leading people to be much more critical and take a closer interest in the quality of water bodies in Scotland. And I think that's really, really healthy that people are focusing on that. And we need to respond to that by providing more evidence, more data, so that people can really see and understand the environment they're living in. So we need to respond and build on that interest in the water environment. And actually, we on the back of that, we start to see the ability of us to run campaigns where we actually do ask the public to stop flushing inappropriate things down the toilet because it causes blockages, it ends up in the environment. Actually, we didn't really feel probably empowered to do that until people started to take a closer interest in the environment, because now it says we say, actually, you're right, we've got something to do. We've got to manage the volumes of water more appropriately so that we don't spill. But equally, you've got something to do because actually some of those spills are about blockages and some of the debris that arrives, it comes directly from a domestic source. So I think actually that greater interest that the public are showing is helpful to us, and we can build on that. Do we need to legislate and change the rules, if you like? I think probably it's an option. We're certainly engaging in policy development at the moment, and that would be a not improbable outcome would be to change some of the legislation. And I think not least to actually really update the legislation around drainage, which is very, very old in Scotland, and I think doesn't reflect even the institutions that exist today, let alone a more appropriate set of processes involving more attenuation on the surface and using water bodies on the surface rather than the grey infrastructure. So I think we have got a good trend of people being more interested in water, and we should build on that. We should be bold about trying out new surface attenuation features, and I think with those we can afford not to fail, but we can afford to manage them and be quite bold about how we use them, and we have the ability to monitor their performance over the time. So perhaps to if they're not working to the degree that we want them to adapt them, change them, learn from those mistakes. So where we won't take risks is clearly on drinking water quality. There we will continue to focus on that. That's a straightforward public health issue. But we can be bold about resource recovery. We can be bold about using different forms of surface water management, because right now, if we don't do things, we are seeing increased flooding. We're seeing people's homes damaged. And so actually, inactivity in this space is more dangerous than taking some bold steps about some new technology. So So I think lots of positives. I think it's people are really engaging, and so we have a really positive agenda to move forward and improve the places people live in. I think, going to Bill's point, we have to make sure that the change is a positive one. Sure, we're reacting to a negative situation in terms of climate and nature emergencies, but actually, if we react it by creating better places that are more pleasant to live in, people enjoy, then that will be an outcome that I think will garner support amongst the public, even if it does have an implication for the price that people pay.
Thank you. And you have mentioned what also Bill, Rachel, and Gordon said before, behavioral aspects and people aspects, bringing the people with you, and like Bill said, what is the benefit for them, and then people will be more supportive. And before we close, I would like to invite all of you to make your closing remarks. If we can start with Rachel, please.
Yeah, so I think there are many challenges that we face in the water sector, and they are so complex and often require this trans or multidisciplinary approach to resolve them. And what we've heard today and what we know from the research that's out there is that it's really time to leave working in silos behind and to reap the benefits of partnership working that are so necessary to address multiple issues and policy goals. And I think from that last question that you had for me, Cecilia, I think to move forwards, we do need to think about the skills base and the expertise going forwards, and considering more about nature restoration jobs, upskilling and reskilling in the kind of green and sustainable job areas, really important if we are going to successfully think about capturing carbon, restoring peatlands, thinking about opportunity mapping on where to put forests to capture carbon. That's all really essential. And then going to the other extreme as well in terms of digital technologies and how we use those in managing water and catchments sustainably. We know that there are changes in digital technologies that are really revolutionizing how we manage water, and developments in sensors and Earth observation platforms are really in the process of transforming how we monitor and understand natural processes across a range of spatial and temporal scales. So I think the future very much is about how we learn patterns of behaviors and relationships in the kind of new and unexpected features of the future. So it's a really exciting time in terms of research innovation. We're moving forwards to really to move and to shift into this new way of working. So I think that's my main thing is that we need to really push hard on the skills front, but we also need to really make the most of our partnership working and collaborations.
Thank you. You have brought again this important thought that came before on broader understanding to new and unexpected situations. And this very changing, challenging situation, it does give an opportunity. Bill.
So I suppose my message is that climate change is with us. And it's an existential crisis. I'm not sure that the water industry have engaged with net zero, but I'm not sure that they're thoroughly engaged with the consequences of climate change. Droughts and floods are going to be the new norm, and we can't continue to just respond as if they are temporary crises. We have to have strategic planning for our water infrastructure for 50 years from now. What should our water infrastructure look like, and plan, taking into account what's financially feasible to do. We should plan now for our water infrastructure in 50 years' time. And I believe that will involve much more local recycling of water, taking pressure off the heavy piped networked infrastructure that we've relied on previously. So that's, I suppose that's what I've got to say. Actually, one more thing. I think that Scotland has a real opportunity to be a leader in this, because we've got a state-owned water company that is highly respected. We've got regulators who are all pulling in the same direction. And I think that combination of society's respect for the water company and the regulators all being able to go into a room and talk together, then there's a real potential for Scotland to be at the forefront of change.
Very much, very much. And I'm very glad you mentioned infrastructure, because many times it's perceived as those pipes. No, it's a way to bring water, to treat water, to collect the wastewater. So infrastructure is very important. And it's not the gray infrastructure, the gray, the blue, the green, the digital infrastructure. So it presents an enormous possibility to study, as you have said, make mistakes, learn, and be able to make a contribution on something so important on this topic. And I would like to finish with John. If you could please make your final remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll try and pick up on another question in the chat as well, if I may, at the same time. So, building on the theme of collaboration, which I think is a really key theme here. It's clear that while Scottish Water is the key utility here delivering services, there are so many other partners in here. So local authorities have a hugely important role. Research has a hugely important role. And as we see, the private sector supply chain that brings the skills, brings the innovation, and supports Scottish Water in delivering so many of its outcomes, all need to work together, and we need to build on that collaboration. But we also need the public to collaborate as well. So we need to widen out to there as well. And we need the regulators to do that. And actually, reflecting on the question that someone was asking really about, firstly, what is Scottish Government's plan to improve discharge monitoring, and what role could stronger regulatory action have in driving standards? I think a couple of reflections on that. So firstly, there is the River Basin Management Plan. We're in the final cycle of that, which finishes in 2027. That drives a lot of improvement, and that we're investing heavily in delivering that. But there's also, on top of that, an Urban Waters Improvement Plan, which again is an interesting on building on the point of collaboration. It comes together, Scottish Water and the regulator SEPA, to try and get a common vision about how we improve the monitoring, how we improve the operation of our existing infrastructure, and then try and improve not by pouring lots of concrete and fixing it, for want of a better expression, CSOs by putting big tanks on them and screens and all this sort of stuff. We'll do a bit of that. Really what we need to do is take the water out of the sewage system, so to stop them spilling in the first place. So that's really important. And I want to then say really that we've got a choice with regulation. We can adopt the parent-child approach, where the regulators come in and fine companies. The companies have to respond to that. But it's quite an old-fashioned approach to regulation. It's quite a dysfunctional approach in my view. I think it's far better if the regulators can come with a common vision alongside government, alongside the regulated entity, Scottish Water, build plans like that Urban Waters Improvement Roadmap, and then make sure they're regulating it, make sure they're standing alongside, driving the performance there, supporting the utility in delivering it. So it is about collaboratively working together, I think, a more mature relationship to regulation and delivery, in fact. And actually that, if we've got a common vision, then that's what drives innovation, because actually everybody wants to achieve the outcome they've agreed in. Everyone is keen to meet the targets. So I want to avoid the parent-child relationship and have this much more mature collaborative approach where we have a really clear vision and we all work as hard as possible to achieve it. So I think that would be a good way to round out the message. I think that it's about positive collaboration across all these different entities with a clear vision in mind, and we incentivize each other to get there because we're all determined to achieve it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think this webinar, to which again I thank all of you for joining, just shows that willingness of collaboration with all of you being so very busy, but from all of you from different sectors and being here today to discuss this very important topic. So again, thank you very much, and happy Easter. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.